Hi, let's continue with our session on variable naming. In this session, we want to discuss the importance of writing your code with clear and valid variable naming that is kind of in line with the general programming practice. So, as a good practice, you want your code to be understood, to be easily read and understood by your future self. I like to talk about that because it tends to be that you'll be reusing your codes quite a bit, and or your teammates, right, who needs to understand what you're writing and then build on top of your code, reuse your code, modify your code, maintain your code, and so on. So it's always good to keep the practice handy and start developing that habit from day one so that it becomes a habit so strong that you just feel weird doing it any other way. So earlier on, we started off just having some casual programming and define variables like a equals 1. So we define it because a has never been defined before, and we use the value 1 and put inside this container. So when we say define a variable, think of us physically grabbing a no label container and then sticking on this label called a. What do we put inside this container called a? We put a value called 1 put inside. So this is what this statement here, the highlighted statement here, does. Now a is good, however a may not be good enough. It tends to be that in general our variable naming convention follows a camel case usage uh, naming convention. So what that means is camel case, the camel has got humps, right? So so we start off with small case as a convention. We always start with small case, and then whenever there is a word boundary, for example, a function, my data, such as this one, my data, there's a word boundary here, then the second word, or from there on, all word boundaries will have a single capital case, such as this year profits. There's supposed to be three words, right? We start off with lowercase, and there's a word boundary here, so we have a capital Y, and another word boundary here, we have a capital P. We could have called this TYP, but then that is not very uh, descriptive of the meaning of the value being contained here. So when we read this line, just this line alone, does it suggest something? Does it suggest something to you? Well, you get the idea that it's probably talking about a company or even person, and it's about the profit money. We don't know the monetary unit. Fine, no problem. But we know that this is 123 units dollars maybe, and it's for this year only. So we can get a lot if you label your variable meaningfully. All right. So if you use TYP, then maybe you know today, maybe you read the code again next week, you know. But even for yourself, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, you come back and read your code, it may not be very meaningful. Yeah. So we like variable names that are descriptive, that are as meaningful as possible, and follow camel case convention. Okay. There is another convention that is also quite common, but it is going to involve the use of the underscore character. So one way to think about that is this. So the mean of all squared errors, all right, so in this case, there are 5 words. We could have done word boundaries like mean, then capital O, then small f, and so on. We could have done the camel casing convention, but in this case, programmer chooses to use underscore in place of spaces for every word boundary. That is also quite acceptable. And if you do this, you ought to be consistent. So, but the meaning of consistent is this kind of mix and match, sometimes using camel, sometimes using underscore, to label your very descriptive variable is not encouraged. You should try to be consistent. Okay, so for example, I have seen SQL codes, SQL database access codes tend to use underscore a lot because uh, certain popular SQL packages like SQLite, MySQL, the sample codes already started using underscore. So the so to speak, the primary core programmers already started using that convention, and when we do programming, we look at the sample codes, we tend to follow so that we are not confused ourselves. So that habit becomes, you know, quickly adopted by people downloading the codes and using the codes. So that's fine. And if you have a module that uh, is solely, all right, created to interface with SQL, MySQL database, that's probably nice that you follow the same convention so that it's quite readable. But for your other modules, within your other modules themselves, you could switch to sticking to camel case naming convention. Now, one thing to talk about naming, right? So variable namings are quite easy to remember. All characters, all alpha numeric characters are allowed. You can use ABC 123, ABC 456. But the first character has to be either alpha or underscore. So it is okay to have underscore my underscore values. It is valid, it is acceptable to Python, but not encouraged. So again, here I put in the comment. They are valid. You won't see problems coming up when you have underscore in front as your variable name. But it is highly discouraged, all right, unless you know what you're doing. So let's put this into Spider and have a look. Okay, not proper convention. I think this is this. All right, good. So we have all these, they are all valid. We have all these, they are, when I run it, it will be quite okay because there's no red flag. So when I run it, well, let me just start with a new shell. When I run it, there should be no red flag. Things are fine, and A is defined. A is defined correctly. Oh, sorry, something's wrong. A is defined correctly, X is defined correctly, and even underscore my values, there's nothing wrong with it. Underscore temp values, which is supposed to be 333, has no problem to it. But having underscore at the start is highly discouraged, right? Because whenever there's an underscore starting it, only a single underscore, it tends to be user created internal values. So this goes into things like class objects, where you need to have your own little private space to calculate, but you don't want to expose those variables to outsiders. So in Python, the access restriction is not prevented. People can still inspect. So earlier on, we talked about having my class, right? So, and we said something like C equals to 1, 2, 3, okay? Or this is basically C is to be added to, C is a constant object to anything that considers my class. But we don't want this to be known to outside people. So we can actually put an underscore C. Then in this case, all right,